He found the ring at 6:44 in the morning, not hidden, not thrown across the room in anger, just sitting there at the bottom of a glass of water on the kitchen counter. Her wedding ring, a thin gold band with a small diamond he'd picked out himself, resting at the bottom like it had been placed there deliberately. Like a period at the end of a sentence he hadn't known was being written. Kang Seojin stood in his kitchen in a $3,000 robe and stared at that glass for a long time. The penthouse was dead quiet. No movement. No sound of her breathing from the bedroom. No smell of the Rwandan coffee she brewed every morning, even though she hated Seoul's water. Just the city lights below, still blinking like nothing had changed, and that ring sitting underwater like a small, patient accusation. He knew before he checked the bedroom. He knew before he opened the closet and saw the careful absence. Not ransacked, not dramatic, just one suitcase worth of space where her things used to be. She hadn't taken everything. She'd taken exactly what was hers. That was the part that got him. Before we go further, if this story is already making your chest tight, you're exactly where we need you. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what Amara did next is something nobody saw coming. Not Seojin, not his people, not even the woman who thought she'd already won. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started to fall apart. 3 years before the morning of the ring, Kang Seojin had never once in his adult life been told to move. He was 41 years old, born in Busan, built in Seoul, and feared across 6 countries. He owned legitimate companies, logistics, real estate, import consulting, and he owned the other kind too, the kind that didn't appear on any government registry, the kind that kept certain politicians generous and certain prosecutors quiet. He had a security detail that rotated in 8-hour shifts in a penthouse on the 53rd floor with windows that made the whole city look like something he'd bought and put on a shelf. He did not get told to move, but at a private reception in the Gangnam district, one of those gatherings where every handshake was worth $1,000,000 and nobody said anything honest, a woman in a dark green dress looked at him standing in front of the window, tilted her head slightly, and said, "You're blocking the view." Not rudely. Not with a smile designed to charm him either, just as a fact. He turned around. The city was spread out behind him, lit up and enormous. He looked back at her. "You came here for the view?" he asked. "I came here for the view and the shrimp," she said, "and you're blocking one of them." He moved. He couldn't explain why exactly. He'd had women laugh at his jokes, perform intelligence for him, dress carefully to catch his attention. He'd had women pretend not to know who he was, and then pretend they hadn't been pretending. He understood all those games. He'd been playing them since he was 22 years old. This woman wasn't playing anything. She genuinely wanted to see the city, and she genuinely wanted the shrimp, and she was not particularly interested in whether he found that charming or not. Her name was Amara Okoye. She was 34, Nigerian by birth, and by deep, unshakable pride, and she'd been living in Seoul for 2 years working as a financial strategist for a Seoul-based international investment group. She spoke Korean, English, French, Igbo, and enough Japanese to make her colleagues nervous. She had a graduate degree from the London School of Economics and a reputation in her office for being the person who spotted the problem everyone else missed. Seojin learned all of this over the following 3 weeks, during which he found excuses to appear in places Amara was, not in a threatening way, not with resources pointed at her, but in the way of a man who realized he was genuinely curious about a person for the first time in years. She was not impressed by his penthouse when he finally showed it to her. She walked through it and said the kitchen was well designed and asked if he actually cooked in it. He didn't. He had a chef. "Then the kitchen is decoration," she said. "Most things in this apartment are decoration," he said before he could stop himself. She looked at him then, really looked, the way she did when she was deciding whether something was worth her attention. "At least you know it," she said. That was the moment, not the green dress, not the shrimp line, not her indifference to his reputation. That moment where he said something true by accident and she heard it and didn't flinch. He asked her to dinner. She said she was busy that week. He asked again the following week. She agreed, and when they sat across from each other at a restaurant where the menu had no prices, she asked him directly, "What do you actually want from this?" No one had ever asked him that. Not like that. Not expecting a real answer. "I don't know yet," he said. That's an honest answer, she said. I'll give you one more dinner to figure it out. He needed 4 more dinners. But he figured it out. He wanted her, not the performance of her. Her. They married 14 months after that first conversation. The wedding was small by Seojin's world standards. 60 people, a private venue, no press. Amara had insisted. She didn't want to be a headline. She didn't want to be displayed. She wanted to marry a man, not a brand. Seojin agreed to everything she asked. He meant it at the time. He genuinely meant it. The first year of their marriage was the best year of Seojin's adult life, and he knew it even while it was happening, which was unusual for him. He was not a man given to recognizing good things in real time. Usually he understood what something was worth only after it was gone. But Amara changed his apartment, not dramatically. She didn't redecorate or hire people to come in with swatches. She just added herself to it. A wooden bowl of fruit on the counter, books stacked in specific places, the smell of cocoa butter in the bathroom, her voice on phone calls in French or Igbo, fast and warm, laughing with her sister or her mother back in Lagos. The penthouse stopped feeling like a waiting room, his staff noticed. His security chief, Min Tae-woo, who had worked for Seojin for 11 years and was constitutionally incapable of sentiment, told him once, in the blunt, emotionless tone he used for everything, that the household ran better with Amara in it. She asked the right questions, Tae-woo said. People want to do their jobs correctly when she's around. Seojin took that as a compliment to himself. He shouldn't have. Amara never tried to involve herself in Seojin's business operations. She asked questions sometimes, not prying questions, but the kind of questions that came from genuine intelligence and genuine curiosity, the kind that revealed she understood more than she was given credit for. She understood how supply chains worked. She understood regulatory structures. She understood the pressure points in international finance that most people spent careers trying to locate. Seojin answered her questions vaguely. He kept his 2 worlds, the legitimate and the other kind, separate in his mind, and he kept them separate from Amara the same way. He thought he was protecting her. He was actually teaching her everything she needed to know. The first time he was unfaithful, it was 8 months into their marriage. A business trip to Tokyo. A woman named Yoona Choi, who ran a small talent agency that had been useful to certain operations for several years. Yoona was beautiful and entirely uncomplicated. She never asked hard questions. She never looked at him like she was measuring something. She laughed at everything he said and made him feel large and unchallenged and easy. He told himself it was a one-time thing. He told himself this 4 more times over the following year. By the time their second anniversary arrived, Seojin had constructed a careful parallel reality. In the penthouse with Amara, he was a husband, attentive enough, present enough, convincing enough. In the other spaces, he was whatever Yoona needed him to be. He kept the 2 worlds from touching. He was meticulous about it. He believed, with complete confidence, that Amara had no idea. He was wrong about this the way people are catastrophically wrong about things. Not because the evidence was hidden, but because they never seriously entertained the possibility that they'd been seen. Amara had known for over a year. She didn't know because she'd hired someone or hacked his phone or gone through his messages. She knew because she was Amara Okoye, and she had spent her entire adult life learning how to read what was really happening beneath the surface of what people showed her. She'd grown up in a complicated family. She'd worked in international finance, where deception was a professional skill. She understood how people moved when they were hiding something. She understood the small, consistent wrongnesses in behavior that most people dismissed as mood or stress or tiredness. Seojin thought he was careful. He was not even close to careful enough. The question Amara sat with alone at night while Seojin slept beside her was not whether he was lying. She already knew he was lying. The question was what she was going to do about it, and that question she took her time answering. She did not cry in front of him. She did not pick fights over small things the way she might have if she were trying to express something she couldn't say directly. She did not become cold or withdrawn in any way he could easily read. She moved through their shared life with the same steady composure she'd always had, and underneath that composure, she was thinking very clearly about what she needed. She called her attorney, a woman named Elena Park, who had been her personal lawyer since Amara first arrived in Seoul, and who had a reputation for being the person you called when you needed someone intelligent in your corner. Amara did not frame it as divorce proceedings. Not yet. She framed it as financial planning. She wanted to understand her own financial position in full. She wanted to know exactly what was hers and exactly what wasn't, and exactly where the lines were. Elena asked no unnecessary questions. She understood what kind of meeting this was. Amara also began paying closer attention to Seojin's business structures, not his illegal operations, but the legitimate ones, the ones that surrounded and supported the rest of the operation, the way scaffolding supports a building under construction. She understood corporate structures. She understood how ownership worked. She asked her occasional questions with the same casual curiosity she'd always shown, and Seojin answered them with the same fond, vague condescension he'd always offered. Every answer was a piece of information. She was not planning to destroy him. She was not building a weapon. She was building a map of her own position within a world that was not hers, so that she would know every possible exit when the time came. 3 years in, the morning everything cracked open. It was not Seojin who broke it. It was Yuna Choi. Yuna had been managing the arrangement in her head as something more than it was. The way people do when they've been telling themselves a story long enough that they start to believe the version they prefer. She had been growing impatient with her role at the edges of Seojin's life. She wanted to be seen, she wanted acknowledgement, and she had decided, in the particular reckless logic of someone who had mistaken their position entirely, that the obstacle between her and what she wanted was a woman named Amara. She called the penthouse on a Tuesday afternoon. Seojin was in a meeting. Amara answered. Yuna expected panic. She expected tears or screaming or the kind of desperate emotional reaction that would confirm everything she'd been telling herself about the woman she was up against. Amara said nothing for a moment after Yuna identified herself. Just a breath. Then she said, "I appreciate you calling directly." Yuna didn't know what to do with that. She pushed. She said things designed to wound, about Seojin's feelings, about what the relationship really meant, about Amara's position in his life versus the position she imagined she held. Amara listened. She let Yuna finish. "Thank you for the information," Amara said. "I already had most of it, but I appreciate the confirmation." She ended the call. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, her hand still on the phone, looking out at the city. Then she called Elena Park, and she said, "Let's finish the plan." Seojin came home that evening to a wife who made dinner and asked about his day. She looked the same. She sounded the same. He felt vaguely uneasy in a way he couldn't locate, the way you feel when something in a room has changed but you can't identify what. He told himself he was tired. He told himself the unease was nothing. He was wrong about that too. Amara served him dinner across a table they'd eaten at 1,000 times. And while he talked about logistics contracts in a meeting that had gone long, she watched him with clear eyes and made the final decision she had been approaching for months. She was done waiting for him to become who he'd promised to be. The ring went into the water glass at 3:17 in the morning, and by the time the city started waking up, Amara Okoye was already gone. Seojin stood at the kitchen counter for 4 minutes without moving. He knew it was 4 minutes because the digital clock on the microwave changed twice while he stood there, staring at the glass of water with the ring inside it. The ring caught the morning light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows and threw a small, pale reflection on the counter beside it. He noticed that. He noticed it the way your brain latches onto irrelevant details when it's refusing to process the relevant ones. He picked up the glass, set it down, picked it up again. Then he went to the bedroom. The closet was the confirmation he already knew was coming. Her side was not empty. That was the thing that hit him sideways. If it had been empty, stripped bare, it would have looked like anger, like destruction. But it wasn't. About a third of her clothes were gone, the things she used every day, the things that were distinctly functionally hers. The rest hung there like she might come back for them sometime, or might not, and either way it wasn't urgent. She hadn't left in a rage. She'd left like she'd planned it down to the last item. He found the envelope on the nightstand on her side of the bed. His name on the front in her handwriting, clean, unhurried, the same handwriting she used when she left him grocery notes. He stood there holding it for a long time before he opened it. He almost didn't open it. He did. Inside was not a letter. It was a document, several pages, printed, organized with the kind of precision that made his chest tighten in a way he didn't have words for. It outlined, in clear and factual language, what she knew. Not accusations, not emotional recounting. Facts. Dates. Structures. Specific elements of his legitimate business operations that she had quietly, thoroughly understood during 3 years of what he'd thought was her simply being beside him. She hadn't stolen anything. She hadn't exposed anything. She had simply documented that she could. Seojin sat on the edge of the bed and read every page. By the time he finished, the city outside was fully awake. He called Taewoo. Taewoo picked up on the second ring, which was typical. Taewoo slept light and answered fast and never sounded like he'd been asleep even when he had. He'd been with Seojin since Seojin was 30 years old, and in 11 years he had seen things that would have broken most men, and none of those things had visibly touched him. "She's gone," Seojin said. A pause. Short. "I know." Seojin's jaw tightened. "What do you mean you know?" "I mean, I'm aware she left. Her car isn't in the garage. She took a taxi at 3:22 this morning. You watched her leave. I was notified. My job is to know what happens in this building. Your job is to protect this household." "Yes." Taewoo's voice was flat as pavement. "She wasn't in danger. She was leaving." Seojin stood up from the bed and walked back to the window. The city spread out below him, indifferent and enormous. "Why didn't you call me?" "Because it was 3:22 in the morning and she had the right to go." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Seojin pressed 2 fingers against the glass. The glass was cold. "Get here," Seojin said. "Now." Taewoo was there in 22 minutes. He came alone, which was unusual. He usually traveled with at least one of the security rotation, but this morning he came up in the elevator by himself, walked into the penthouse, and stood in the middle of the living room with his hands at his sides, waiting. Seojin was still in his robe. He hadn't changed, hadn't showered. I was standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee he'd made and not touched, and when Taewoo walked in, he didn't turn around. "Sit down," Seojin said. "I'll stand." Seojin turned around then. He looked at Taewoo for a long moment. This man who had been beside him for 11 years, who had never once in all that time shown him anything resembling sentiment or hesitation. And he said, "How long did you know she was preparing to leave?" Taewoo didn't look away. "Approximately 8 months." The number landed like a fist. 8 months, Seojin repeated. She started meeting with her attorney in private approximately 8 months ago. She separated 3 personal financial accounts from the joint accounts over a period of 6 months. She had 2 private conversations with a relocation consultant, residential consulting, international, about 5 months ago. She's been building toward this for a long time. Seojin set the coffee cup down, carefully. The careful way he handled things when he was close to not being careful at all. "And you said nothing." "I reported what I observed. I flagged it." "You flagged it?" "To you, 3 times. In the weekly security briefings, you categorized it as her managing her own finances independently and said it was not a concern." Taewoo's voice carried zero defensiveness. He was just stating facts the same way he stated everything, without decoration, without apology. "You told me not to surveil her movements beyond standard household security protocol. I followed your instruction." Seojin stared at him. He remembered those briefings. He remembered Taewoo noting that Amara had been meeting with her attorney more frequently. He remembered filing it away as her simply being thorough, independent. He'd even felt a faint pride about it. His wife, managing her own affairs, not needing to come to him for every small thing. He'd taken her self-sufficiency as confirmation that everything between them was fine. He had been an idiot. "Find out where she is," Seojin said. Taewoo looked at him, just looked. "Why?" "What do you mean, why? What is the purpose of locating her?" Taewoo's tone didn't change, but something in his posture shifted slightly. A small, deliberate stillness. "She is not missing. She is not in danger. She left of her own choice with her own belongings. What do you intend to do with her location?" "That's not your question to ask." "With respect," Taewoo said, and when Taewoo used those 2 words, it always meant the opposite of the deference they implied. "It is my question, because whatever you're planning to do next, I'm involved in it, so I'm asking." The 2 men looked at each other across the kitchen. The untouched coffee sat between them, going cold. "I want to talk to her," Seojin finally said. "She doesn't want to talk to you. If she wanted to talk to you, she would have left a phone number instead of a document." Seojin turned away, pressed both hands flat on the counter, breathed. He was not a man who processed humiliation gracefully. He had spent 20 years constructing a world in which humiliation was something that happened to other people, to the ones who misjudged situations, who made weak choices, who failed to account for the variables. He had always accounted for the variables. That was the thing he'd told himself. That was the story he'd lived inside. The variable he had not accounted for was his wife. "Get out," he said. "Come back in an hour. We need to talk about the Inchin situation, and I need to—" He stopped. "Come back in an hour." Taewoo left without another word. Seojin stood at that counter for a long time after the elevator doors closed. Then he picked up his phone and called the one number he should not have called. Yuna answered on the first ring. "I need you to tell me exactly what you said to her," Seojin said. No greeting, no preamble. A pause. Then Yuna's voice, careful and layered with something that was trying to be innocent. "I just wanted her to know the truth." "What did you say?" Another pause, longer. "I called her a few days ago. I told her that you called my home." Seojin's voice went very quiet, which was the register people who knew him understood as the dangerous one. Not raised, not sharp, quiet, and stripped of everything except its meaning. "You called my home and spoke to my wife." Seojin, she needed to know. "You called my home," he said again, like he was still processing the dimension of this particular mistake. "Without my knowledge, without my agreement, and you said what to her exactly?" Yuna's voice got smaller. She understood now that she had miscalculated something, though she wasn't sure yet how badly. "I told her that we've been together, that you have feelings for me, that the marriage—" "Stop!" He closed his eyes, pressed two fingers against his forehead. "Stop talking." "I thought you did not think that is the entire problem." He opened his eyes. "Don't call me, don't contact me, we're done." "Seojin?" He ended the call. He stood in the silence of his penthouse, this enormous, expensive, architecturally perfect penthouse that had started to feel like a person when Amara was in it and now felt like what it actually was, which was a very large, very empty room. And he breathed slowly through his nose and tried to reconstruct the sequence of events in a way that made him something other than the cause of all of them. He couldn't. The document she'd left. I went back and read it again, standing at the kitchen counter, page by page. And the thing about it, the thing that kept catching in his chest like a splinter, was its tone. It wasn't cold. It wasn't a weapon. It read like a report written by someone who wanted to be understood, not feared. She had laid out what she knew, not to threaten him, but to show him. "I saw you. I saw all of it. I was not the woman you thought you married. I was always paying attention." He had pages from his own business structures laid out by his wife's hand, analyzed with the precision of someone who could have done something with all of it and chose not to. That was the part he couldn't get past. She could have. She hadn't. By noon, word had moved, the way word always moved in the circles Seojin operated in, through implication and observation rather than direct communication, that something had happened in the Kang household. He started getting calls from associates, polite calls, checking-in calls, the kind of calls that were really questions wearing the costume of concern. He took 2 of them and gave nothing away and let the rest go to voicemail. At 1:15 in the afternoon, a man named Director Huang, whose official title was in the city planning office, and whose actual relationship to Seojin's operations was significantly more complicated, arrived at the penthouse unannounced. His driver called up from the lobby. Seojin almost didn't let him in. He let him in. Director Huang was 63 years old, heavy-set, with the smooth face of a man who had spent decades letting other people carry visible stress on his behalf. He sat on the white sofa in Seojin's living room and accepted the water Seojin's housekeeper brought and looked around the apartment with the casual assessment of someone pricing things. "I heard your wife has traveled," Huang said. "She has. Business? Personal?" Huang nodded slowly. He turned the water glass in his hands. "I only ask because certain of our shared arrangements involve her, tangentially. The property holding in Mapogu, for instance. Her name appears on certain— Her name appears nowhere on anything that matters," Seojin said. "I managed the documentation carefully." Huang's expression shifted slightly, just slightly. "Of course. I'm sure you did." He paused. "Still, it might be worth clarifying her current status. Her intentions going forward, for everyone's comfort." Seojin looked at him. "Her intentions are her own. She has no interest in my business operations." And you're confident of that? Yes. Huang smiled the smile of a man who had been in rooms like this one for 40 years. Then there's nothing to concern ourselves with. He stood, set the water glass down, buttoned his jacket. I hope she returns soon. She was always a lovely presence. Your home feels different without her. He left. Seojin watched the elevator doors close and thought about everything Huang had not said directly. He thought about it for a long time. Then he called Taewoo back. Huang was just here, he said. I know. I saw him in the lobby. He's nervous about Amara. He should be. Taewoo's voice was its usual flat. She spent 3 years sitting across dinner tables from every major associate you have. She understands the architecture of everything you've built. If he's nervous, that's a reasonable reaction. She won't say anything. You're confident of that? Yes. Based on what exactly? A pause. The fact that she could have already and chose not to? The question sat in the air between them. Yes, Seojin said. That's not a guarantee, Taewoo said. That's a bet. Seojin hung up. The afternoon stretched out around him. He changed, finally, sat at his desk in his home office and tried to work. His assistant sent 3 documents that needed review, and he opened all 3 and read none of them. His eyes moved across the text and registered nothing. His head kept returning to the same set of images. The glass of water, the ring at the bottom, the closet with the precise, deliberate absence, the document, her handwriting on the envelope. At 4:30 in the afternoon, his mother called. He almost didn't answer this one either. He answered. Kang Gong-suk was 70 years old and had spent her entire life being underestimated by men who misread her softness for weakness. She was small, and she dressed carefully, and she spoke quietly, and she had a mind like a blade. She had never once approved of Seojin's business arrangements, not the legitimate ones, and especially not the others, but she had also never tried to stop him, because she understood that Seojin had been going to do what Seojin was going to do from approximately the age of 17, and her energy was better spent elsewhere. She had, however, approved of Amara. She had approved of Amara in the specific, enthusiastic way she approved of very few things, quietly, consistently, and without ever making it into a statement he could argue with. Seojina, she said. I know why you're calling, he said. Good. A pause. Then I don't have to explain it. Mother, what did you do? She said. Not a question. A statement with a question mark attached to give him the courtesy of responding. He was quiet for a moment. It's complicated. It isn't. Her voice was gentle in the particular way of things that are both gentle and immovable. You were unfaithful. She found out. She left. That's not complicated. That's very simple. The complicated part is what comes next. I'm trying to figure out what comes next. No. She paused again. You're trying to figure out how to get her back. That's different. Isn't it the same thing? No, Seojin, getting her back is about you. Figuring out what comes next should be about her. A beat. Where is she? I don't know yet. Find out if she's safe. Not to bring her home, just to know she's safe. That's the first thing. After the call ended, Seojin sat in the quiet of his office and did the thing he almost never did. He thought about someone else's position instead of his own. He tried to reconstruct it. 3 years. She had known for over a year. The document made that clear, the precision of it, the depth. She had sat across dinner tables from him. She had asked him questions. She had laughed at things he said. She had slept beside him. And underneath all of it, she had been doing something else entirely. Not revenge. Not destruction. Survival. He called Taewoo again. Find out if she's safe, he said. Not where she is. Not what she's planning. Just, is she somewhere she's okay? A long pause. That's a different request from this morning. I know. I'll find out, Taewoo said. The answer came back at 7 in the evening. She was in a hotel in Itaewon. She had checked in under her own name, which meant she wasn't hiding. She had ordered room service at 5:30. She had made 2 phone calls, one to her sister in Lagos, one to her attorney. Safe, just gone. Seojin poured himself 2 fingers of scotch and stood at the window in the dark of his living room and looked at the city he controlled and thought about the woman somewhere out there in it, who had left a glass of water with a ring inside it as her final statement, and he understood, slowly, against his will, in the painful and specific way that real understanding always costs something, that he had not lost something he controlled. He had lost something he didn't deserve. 2 days passed, then 3. He did not contact her. Not because Taiwu had talked him out of it, not because anyone had advised against it, but because he kept picking up his phone and putting it back down, and each time he couldn't find words that didn't sound like a man trying to retrieve what he'd broken by pretending the break hadn't happened. On the 4th day, everything shifted. Director Huang called. Not the polite checking-in call of a few days ago. This call was short and stripped and had an edge underneath it that Seojin hadn't heard from Huang in years. "There's a problem," Huang said. "What kind?" "The Mapo property. The audit." Seojin's hand tightened on the phone. "What audit?" "The city-level financial review that was triggered 3 days ago. Someone filed a formal complaint about the valuation discrepancy on the 2021 transfer." "Who filed it?" A pause on Huang's end. The kind of pause that meant the answer was going to be unpleasant. "We don't have a name yet. It came through a legal firm, Park and Associates." The name hit Seojin somewhere below the ribs. Park and Associates was Elena Park's firm. Elena Park was Amara's attorney. He didn't say anything for a moment, just breathed through it. Huang waited on the other end of the line, and in that silence between them, the weight of what had just happened settled into the space like weather. She had said she wasn't going to use what she knew, but she had kept Elena Park on retainer, and Elena Park had filed a complaint, and now there was an audit. "Huang," Seojin said, his voice stripped of everything except the words. "Pull the documents on the Mapo transfer. Everything. I need them tonight." Seojin, "Tonight." He ended the call and stood in his office with the phone in his hand and looked at the document Amara had left him. He'd kept it on his desk, he realized, the entire 4 days, without consciously deciding to, and he reread the section that covered the Mapo property. She had noted it. She had outlined the valuation structure. She had identified the exact discrepancy that a city auditor would flag if someone knew where to point them. She had not destroyed him, but she had handed the match to someone who could and left it lit on the table. Seojin understood then, fully and without any remaining room for self-deception, that the woman he had spent 3 years underestimating had never for a single moment underestimated him, and that she had prepared for every possible version of what came after she walked out the door, including the version where he decided her departure was a problem to be managed rather than a consequence to be accepted. She was not missing. She was not hiding. She was not waiting to be found. She was 3 steps ahead of him in a game he hadn't known they were playing, and he had no move left that didn't make it worse. The documents came at 11:40 that night. Taewoo brought them himself, which meant it was bad. Taewoo sent assistants for routine deliveries. He came in person when the thing being delivered required a human being in the room to absorb the fallout. He set a manila folder on Seojin's desk without a word and stood back. Seojin opened it. The Mapo property transfer, a commercial building purchased in 2019 through a shell holding company, transferred in 2021 to a secondary entity at a valuation significantly below market rate. The difference absorbed quietly through mechanisms that existed in the gray space between aggressive accounting and outright fraud, was laid out in front of him in the language of a formal audit inquiry. City letterhead, case number, assigned investigator, and attached to the back of the inquiry, a copy of the original complaint, filed through Park and Associates, signed by a client whose name was listed only as a legal representative acting on behalf of a third party, but the filing included documentation of the valuation discrepancy that could only have come from someone who had access to the internal structure of the transaction. Not public records, internal documents. The kind of documents that lived in protected digital files and the memories of the 4 people who had been in the room when the transfer was structured. Seojin set the folder down. He looked at the wall for a moment. "The 4 people who knew the full structure of the Mapo transfer," he said. "Walk me through them." Taewoo already had it ready. He'd been thinking about this on the drive over. "You, me, Director Huang, and the attorney who drafted the holding company paperwork, Baek Junho. Beck. He left your retainer 14 months ago. You remember why." Seojin remembered. A disagreement over fees that had turned into something uglier than it needed to be. Beck had left with cold professionalism and a non-disclosure agreement and a settlement that Seojin had considered generous. "You're telling me Beck gave documents to Elena Park. I'm telling you the complaint contains information that could only have come from one of 4 sources. You and I didn't file it. Huang didn't file it. This audit hurts him as much as it hurts you, which leaves Baek. Tae-woo paused. Or someone Baek spoke to. Find him. Already working on it. Seojin stood up from the desk and walked to the window. It was nearly midnight. The city was quieter now, but still lit, still moving at its lower nighttime frequency. He pressed his palm flat against the glass and felt the cold come through. She didn't do this, he said. It came out less like a statement and more like something he needed to say out loud to make it real. The complaint was filed through her attorney's firm, Tae-woo said carefully. I know, but she didn't commission it. He turned from the window. Think about it. She left 4 days ago. The complaint was filed 3 days ago. She would have had to have set this in motion before she left. Before the ring, before the document, before any of it. Which means it was part of the plan all along, Tae-woo said. Or it's Baek acting independently, and it's a coincidence. There are no coincidences that convenient. No, Tae-woo agreed. There aren't. Seojin sat back down. He picked up the folder and looked at the filing again. The date stamp. The case number. The name of the assigned city investigator, a man named Inspector Go Byung-chan, whom Seojin did not recognize, which meant he was either new or clean or both. He thought about Amara in her hotel room in Itaewon, ordering room service at 5:30, calling her sister in Lagos, talking to Elena Park. He thought about the document she'd left, the map of his own business structures drawn in her handwriting, precise and unjudging and devastating in its accuracy. She had told him in that document what she was capable of. She had shown her hand not as a threat, but as a demonstration. And he had spent 4 days reading it as a farewell when it was also, he understood now, a warning. He slept 3 hours. Maybe less. I was at his desk at 5 in the morning with the folder open and a legal pad beside it and a pen in his hand, working through the architecture of exposure. Which of his legitimate operations touched the MAPO structure? Which of those operations touched the secondary structures? How far the thread could be pulled before it started unraveling things that couldn't be re-raveled? The answer was further than he wanted it to be. Tae-woo came back at 7:30. He looked the same as always, rested, contained, unreadable. Seojin had long suspected Tae-woo simply did not experience the body's normal reactions to stress. The man didn't sweat. He didn't get pale. His hands never shook. Baek Junho, Tae-woo said, sitting across from the desk. He's been in contact with Elena Park's firm for approximately 5 months. The contact was initiated by Park's office. Park went to him. Correct. On whose instruction? Tae-woo looked at him steadily. On the instruction of her client. The room was very quiet for a moment. She went to Baek 5 months ago, Seojin said slowly. She'd already identified Baek as a source. She approached him through Elena. She built a relationship with him, or Elena did on her behalf, over 5 months. And then, timed to her departure, the complaint was filed. That's the sequence as I understand it. Seojin put the pen down. He looked at the legal pad. Pages of notes in his own handwriting, structures and arrows, and circled names. And thought about Amara sitting across their dinner table 8 months ago, 6 months ago, 4 months ago. Asking her occasional questions, listening to his vague answers, taking in everything he offered and everything he didn't offer, and building something from both. She didn't go to Baek to destroy me, he said. No, Tae-woo agreed. She went to Baek to have the option. A complaint isn't a prosecution. An audit isn't a conviction. She filed enough to create pressure to make it clear she had the means, without actually pulling the full trigger. He paused. It's a very precise move. It's a defensive move. Yes. Seojin understood. She wasn't trying to bring him down. She was trying to ensure he didn't come after her. She was building a mutual deterrence. If he moved against her, if he used his resources to complicate her exit, or threaten her position, or drag her back into his orbit, she had a mechanism in place that would cost him more than her absence ever could. She had done to him what he had spent 20 years doing to everyone else. She had made herself too expensive to touch. At 9 in the morning, Director Huang called for the second time. This call was shorter than the first and had more fear in it, which Huang covered with the brittle professionalism of a man who had spent his life managing fear at a distance and was now feeling it up close. The investigator assigned to the Mapo case, Huang said, Go Byung-chan. I looked into him. And? He's clean, actually clean, Seojin. He's been in the city inspector's office for 6 years, and in that time he has not taken a single meeting, a single payment, a single arrangement. Not because he hasn't been approached. He has been. He simply doesn't participate. There are people like that, Seojin said. Very few. And they are always very inconvenient when they appear. Huang's breath came through the line unevenly. I can't get to this one. I know. Then what do we do? We cooperate with the audit, and we manage what can be managed, and we limit exposure. He said it like he was reading instructions from a page. His voice was steady. His hand on the desk was steady. He was good at this, at performing steadiness when steadiness was what the situation required. What was happening inside his chest was something else entirely. That's your answer? Huang said. Cooperate? For now. He ended the call and sat with the silence for a moment. Then he did something he had not done since he was a much younger man, operating in much smaller rooms with much less to lose. He thought seriously about his position from every angle. Not just the angle of power, not just the angle of control, but the angle of reality. What was actually true? What he actually had? What he had actually done? The audit was manageable. Probably. The MAPO structure was designed to be defensible under scrutiny, or at least defensible enough to survive a city-level inquiry without triggering anything larger. Beck's knowledge was significant but not catastrophic. He had been a peripheral figure in the transaction, present for the structural conversation but not the mechanism. What was not manageable, what sat in the center of everything and could not be restructured or reframed or made defensible, was the fact that Amara had been in his life for 3 years and had come to understand it with a precision that exceeded what most of his actual associates possessed. She had not been studying his world to use it against him. She had been studying it to understand the man she married, and what she had learned about the man she married had been enough to make her leave. That was the thing. That was the part that kept surfacing no matter how many other problems he tried to place on top of it. At noon, he made a decision. He called Elena Park's office directly. The receptionist who answered said Ms. Park was unavailable. Tell her Kang Seojin is calling, he said. She'll be available. He was on hold for 90 seconds. Then Elena Park's voice came through, professional, cool, carrying the particular quality of someone who was entirely unsurprised by this call and had already decided how to handle it. Mr. Kang, I want to meet with you, he said. My client has not requested communication through her attorney. I'm not calling about your client. I'm calling about the complaint filed through your office. A pause. I'm not in a position to discuss any filings made through this firm on behalf of any client. I know you're not. He kept his voice level. Even. The voice he used in rooms where being level and even was the only currency that retained value. I'm not asking you to discuss it. I'm asking you to pass a message. Another pause. Longer. What message? Tell her I understand what she did and why she did it. Tell her I'm not going to move against her. Tell her, he stopped, started again. Tell her that I want to talk, not to negotiate, not to make promises, just to talk. One conversation. She can choose the location, the time, every parameter. She can bring her attorney if she wants. I'll come alone. Silence on Elena Park's end. The kind of silence that was doing work. I'll pass that along, she finally said. I cannot tell you whether she'll respond. I know. He ended the call and put the phone face down on the desk. It took 3 days for the response to come. Not through Elena Park. Not by phone. A short message delivered to his office via courier. Actual paper, actual envelope, his name in Amara's handwriting, that contained 6 words and a time. Cafe near the Naksan Park steps. Thursday, 2 o'clock. He arrived 20 minutes early and sat with water and waited and thought about everything he was going to say and how he was going to say it, and by the time she walked through the door at 2:01, he had thrown out everything he'd prepared. She looked fine. That was what hit him first, and he hated himself for being surprised by it. She looked rested and clear-eyed and dressed simply in dark colors, and she sat across from him at the small table and put her bag on the chair beside her and looked at him with an expression that was not anger or sadness or warmth, but simply attention. Clear, direct, patient attention. You look good, he said, because the alternative was silence. I know, she said. It wasn't vanity. It was just a fact she was noting. He put both hands on the table, flat, open. I'm not going to pretend I don't understand what the filing means. I'm not going to pretend I'm not aware of how thoroughly you prepared all of this. I know what you have, and I know what you could do with it. Good, she said. That saves time. I want you to know that I'm not Seojin. She said his name quietly, without heat, and it stopped him. Whatever you're about to say, that you're not going to retaliate, that you're not angry, that you respect what I did, I don't need to hear it. I didn't come here to be reassured. He looked at her. Then why did you come? Because you asked. She said it simply. And because I wanted to see if you understood yet. Understood what? She folded her hands on the table. That you didn't lose a wife. You lost a witness. She let that land before she continued. I was there, Seojin. For 3 years, I was inside your world, in your home, at your tables, in rooms that most people never get close to. And I watched you. And I watched the choices you made. And I watched the man you could have been get smaller and smaller while the man you decided to be got louder. She paused. The affair wasn't even the worst part. He waited. The worst part was how unimportant I was to you while you were doing it. Not as a wife, as a person. You never once considered what I might see, what I might understand, what I might be capable of. Her voice was steady. No tears, no trembling. You looked at me every day for 3 years and you saw a decoration. That's not... He stopped. It was. It was exactly true, and he knew it was exactly true while he was in the process of denying it. He closed his mouth. She watched him close his mouth. Something in her face shifted, not softening exactly, but recognizing. The filing isn't a weapon, she said. It's an insurance policy. You know the difference. Don't touch what I'm building, and I won't touch what you've built. That's all it is. I understand, he said. I need you to mean that. I mean it. She looked at him for a long moment. The cafe moved around them, cups being picked up and set down, low conversations, the sound of the street outside. Small, normal things happening in the middle of something that was not small and not normal. Okay, she said. She picked up her bag. I'm going to go. Amara. He said her name and she paused, still in her seat. The word sorry arrived in his throat and couldn't get out, not because he didn't mean it, but because he understood suddenly that it was too small. The word had the wrong dimensions for the space it needed to fill. I wasted you, he said instead. That's the truth of it. I had something I didn't know what to do with and I wasted it. She looked at him for another moment. Yes, she said. You did. She left. He sat at the table for a long time after she was gone, not moving, not ordering anything, just sitting. The waiter came by twice and he waved him off both times. Outside, Seoul moved through a regular Thursday afternoon, indifferent to the specific wreckage happening in the corner of a small cafe near the Naksan Park steps. He thought he'd feel something when he saw her. He'd thought the meeting would produce some clarity, some path forward, some version of resolution that he could begin to work toward. What he felt was the opposite of clarity. He felt the full weight of what he'd spent 3 years not feeling. He was in the car outside the cafe, Taewoo in the driver's seat waiting with the engine running, when his phone rang. Not a number he recognized. He almost didn't answer. He answered. The voice on the other end was male, professional, careful. Mr. Kang. My name is Inspector Go Byung-chan. I'm the assigned investigator on the Mapogu property inquiry. I'm calling as a professional courtesy to inform you that the scope of the inquiry has been expanded. Seojin's hand tightened on the phone. Expanded how? We received additional documentation this morning from a secondary source, not the original complainant, that extends the relevant transaction history back to 2018. I'm required to inform any party of record when the scope changes. A brief pause. You'll be receiving formal notification by end of business today. I wanted to give you a heads up as a courtesy. I appreciate that, Seojin said, his voice level, his other hand already pressing against Taewoo's shoulder to get his attention. Of course. My office will be in touch. The inspector ended the call. Taewoo looked back at him in the rearview mirror. What happened? The audit expanded. A secondary source provided documentation going back to 2018. He stared at the mirror. Not Amara, a secondary source. Taewoo's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. Huang. The word landed like a stone into still water, and the ripples moved outward in every direction at once. And Seojin sat in the back of the car and understood that the ground under everything he'd built had just shifted in a way that no amount of money or influence or careful management was going to simply shift back. Director Hwang, who had sat on Seojin's white sofa 4 days ago and expressed concern for Amara's well-being and asked whether Seojin was confident in her discretion, had gone to the investigator. Not to help Seojin, not to protect their shared arrangements. Hwang had decided that the audit was coming regardless, that the Mapo exposure was real, and that the safest position available to him was the one where he was the person cooperating with the investigation rather than the one being investigated. He had used the audit Amara's filing created as the moment to step sideways and leave Seojin standing alone in the middle of it. 40 years of accumulated power in this city, and the man Seojin had considered an untouchable ally had just handed 2018 documents to a clean inspector on a Thursday afternoon, while Seojin was sitting in a cafe being honest with his wife for the first time in years. "Drive," Seojin said. Taewoo pulled into traffic. "I need you to find out what Hwang gave them," Seojin said. "Exactly what documents, what period they cover, what transactions are on them." I was already thinking through it, already mapping the structure, already identifying which pieces of his world were in direct contact with 2018 and which were buffered. "And I need our attorney on the phone in the next 20 minutes. "Already calling," Taewoo said, the phone already at his ear. Seojin looked out the window at the city going past. Buildings and people and traffic and the ordinary movement of a place that didn't know or care what was happening in the back of a black sedan moving through it. He thought about Amara walking away from the cafe. He thought about Hwang sitting on his sofa with his careful smile. He thought about the document she'd left on the nightstand with his name in her handwriting. She had shown him a map of his vulnerabilities and told him she wasn't going to use them. Hwang had waited for the moment of maximum vulnerability and used everything he had. The thing Seojin had not calculated, the variable he had missed completely, the same way he had missed Amara for 3 years, was that protecting himself from the person he'd underestimated had left him with his back entirely exposed to the person he'd trusted most. And now the thing that could not be managed, could not be restructured, could not be controlled or bought or intimidated into compliance was no longer his marriage. It was his empire. The attorney's name was Shin Dong-hyun, and he was the best criminal defense and corporate lawyer in Seoul, which meant he was expensive, meticulous, and completely without illusions about the people he worked for. He arrived at the penthouse at 8:47 that evening with a leather briefcase and the particular expression of a man who had already reviewed the situation on the drive over and arrived at conclusions he did not enjoy. Seojin met him in the office. Taewoo stood by the door. Nobody offered anyone coffee. "Tell me how bad," Seojin said. Shin set the briefcase on the desk and opened it and pulled out a single printed sheet, just one, which was itself a statement about what kind of conversation this was going to be. The 2018 documentation covers the initial capitalization of the Mapo holding structure. If what Hwang provided is what I think it is, it connects the original funding source to the secondary operations in a way that the 2021 valuation issue alone would not have. Meaning the 2021 audit on its own was a property valuation dispute. Manageable. Civil exposure, possible fines, restructuring. The 2018 documents, if they show what I think they show, push this into a different category. He said the next word carefully, like he was placing it down in a specific spot. Criminal. The room was very quiet. "What's Hwang's position?" Seojin said. "He's already retained counsel. His attorney called mine 2 hours ago. Professional courtesy," they said. What they were actually doing was establishing that Hwang has begun cooperation discussions. Shin paused. "He hasn't formally flipped yet. He's positioning. He's deciding which side is safer." "He's decided. He's just negotiating his price for making it official." Seojin stood up from the desk and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to both men, looking at the city. His reflection in the glass looked older than he expected. He noticed that and filed it away somewhere and didn't look at it again. "What do I need to do?" he said. "Tonight? Nothing. You do nothing. You say nothing. You make no calls to anyone associated with any of the operations touched by the 2018 documents. Any contact you make from this point forward gets interpreted as evidence of consciousness of guilt or attempted witness influence." Shin closed the briefcase. Tomorrow, you come to my office with every document you have related to every entity in the Mapo chain going back to 2016, and we spend as many hours as it takes building the cleanest possible version of your position. And Huang. Shin looked at him. Huang is a problem that exists in a different column from your legal strategy. Those two columns need to stay completely separate in everything you say and do going forward. Are we clear on that? Crystal. After Shin left, Seojin stood at the window alone for a long time. Taewoo waited, which was what Taewoo did. He waited with the specific patience of someone who understood that there were moments when the useful thing was simply to be present and not speak. He's going to give them everything, Seojin said finally. Not a question. Yes, Taewoo said, and everything he has connects to things that connect to other things. Some of them. A pause. Not all. Enough. Enough, Taewoo agreed. Seojin pressed his fist lightly against the glass. Once. Not hard. Just contact. Just the physical fact of something solid pushing back. How did we not see him moving? We were looking somewhere else, Taewoo said. He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. They both knew where the attention had been for the past week. The ring in the glass, the document on the nightstand, the audit filing, the cafe meeting, all of it had occupied the center of Seojin's focus, while Huang had been making phone calls and meeting with attorneys and calculating the mathematics of betrayal. With the calm of a man who had spent 40 years in rooms where loyalty was always situational. I need to know who Huang has spoken to, Seojin said. Not the investigators. His associates. The people in the network who are going to read his cooperation as a signal about their own positions. I'll get names by morning. And I need to know if there's anyone in his chain who owes me more than they owe him. Taewoo nodded once. I'll work through the night. After he left, Seojin sat at his desk and did not sleep and did not really work and mostly thought. He thought about the structure of everything he'd built, how he had constructed it piece by piece over 20 years, the legitimate and the other kind woven together so that each one supported and obscured the other, so that the whole thing had the appearance of solidity and the reality of mutual dependency. He thought about how much of that structure rested on the assumption that the people inside it would remain more afraid of him than they were of anyone else. Huang had stopped being afraid of him. That was the simple truth at the center of all of it. Not the documents. Not the audit. Not the 2018 capitalization records. The simple structural fact that one of the 4 or 5 men whose cooperation Seojin's world depended on had looked at the current situation and concluded that Seojin was no longer the most dangerous thing in the room. He had to change that calculation, not through threat, not through the old mechanics of fear and consequence. Shin had been clear. Any move that looked like pressure or intimidation or witness influence would accelerate the legal exposure rather than contain it. He could not go at Huang directly. He had to make Huang's cooperation worthless before Huang could make it damaging. I was still at his desk at 4 in the morning when the shape of it came to him. Not a plan exactly, more like a recognition of the one move available that nobody would expect, including himself. He picked up the phone and called Shin. Shin answered on the 3rd ring, voice thick with interrupted sleep. This better be? I want to discuss voluntary disclosure, Seojin said. A long pause. He heard Shin sitting up. Say that again. Voluntary disclosure, proactive cooperation with the audit, getting ahead of whatever Huang is going to give them by providing our own account first and controlling the framing. Another pause, longer. Seojin, do you understand what that means in terms of exposure? I understand it means I choose what gets disclosed and how it gets characterized instead of letting Huang choose. It also means you are walking into the investigation rather than making them drag you in. That is a fundamentally different legal posture. I know what it is, Seojin said. Can it be done in a way that limits the criminal exposure while addressing the civil liability? Shin was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was actually thinking, not resistance. It's possible. It would require very careful structuring of what we disclose and in what sequence. We'd need to get ahead of any documentation Huang can provide that contradicts our account. A pause. It would require you to give up certain things. I know. Significant things. I know. And you're prepared to do that. I'm prepared to decide what I'm willing to lose and keep everything else, Seojin said. Get to my office at 8. We'll work through what that looks like. He put the phone down. He sat for another moment in the silence of the office. Then he opened the desk drawer and took out the document Amara had left. He'd moved it from the nightstand to the desk after the first night, and it had stayed there, moved from the center of the desk surface to the side and then to the drawer, but never put away entirely. He didn't read it again. He just set it on the desk in front of him and looked at it. She had mapped his vulnerabilities without his knowledge, and then left the map on his nightstand. She had done it not to destroy him, but to ensure her own safety. She had been smarter than him, more patient than him, more honest with herself about what was real and what was performance. He had spent 20 years being the most dangerous person in any room he entered. She had walked out of his life and within 1 week exposed the fact that the structure of his power was held together by the cooperation of men who were, at their cores, exactly as self-interested as anyone else. Men who would hold as long as holding was the safe choice, and would fold the moment a safer choice appeared. He was not the most dangerous thing in the room. He'd just been operating in rooms where everyone was too careful to demonstrate that. At 7:30 in the morning, before Shin arrived, Taiwu came in with the names. 7 men in Huang's immediate network. Of those 7, 3 had significant existing obligations to Seojin that predated their relationships with Huang. 2 of those 3 were men. Seojin had done genuine favors for, not the transactional kind, not the kind that came with implicit price tags, but the kind that came from a human moment, a time when someone needed something and Seojin had provided it without calculation. One of those men was a city council member named Lim Jae-sung. 12 years ago, Lim's son had gotten into a situation, the kind of situation that, if it had moved through normal channels, would have destroyed the boy's life before it started. Seojin had intervened, not to own Lim. He'd intervened because the situation was genuinely unjust and the boy was genuinely not responsible for the worst interpretation of it. And Seojin had been in a position to make a phone call, and he'd made it. He had never once called that dead in. He called it now. Lim Jae-sung answered on the second ring. He sounded like a man who had not slept either. "You know why I'm calling," Seojin said. "I've been expecting it," Lim said. His voice was careful, measured. "Since yesterday evening. Huang is going to position himself as a cooperating witness. The people in his network are going to have to make decisions about where they stand. I know. I'm asking you to stand where you've always stood." A long silence. "Seojin, what you're asking, I'm not asking you to lie. I'm not asking you to do anything that puts you in a worse position than you're already in. I'm asking you to be accurate about timelines and to make yourself available to our legal team before you're approached by theirs." He paused. "That's all. Accurate and available." Another silence. Longer. "And in return?" "Nothing. That's not how this works between us. I'm not adding a transaction to a relationship that was never transactional." He meant it. He heard Lim hear him mean it. "But I need to know before I walk into Shin's office in 30 minutes, whether I'm building a picture of events that has you in it, or whether I'm building one that works without you." The silence this time was the kind where a decision was happening. "I'll call your attorney," Lim said finally, "by 9. "Thank you." He ended the call and sat with it for a moment. Then he called 2 more people. He didn't get the same answer from both of them. One was evasive in a way that told him everything, and he marked that person in the column of those he'd need to wall off from rather than rely on. But one answer, delivered by a logistics executive named Park Chan-soo, who owed Seojin a debt of an entirely different kind, was direct and unhesitating. "Tell me what you need." 3 people. It wasn't an army, but it was a position, and a position was something to build from. Shin arrived at 8:02 with 2 associates and a rolling cart of files, which told Seojin the attorney had also not slept, and had spent the night preparing for exactly the conversation Seojin had proposed at 4 in the morning. They sat around the conference table in the office, and they worked. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon without stopping except for water, and once, bad coffee that somebody's assistant produced and nobody actually drank. The picture that emerged, over hours of careful construction, was not clean. It was not a story of innocent misunderstanding or regulatory gray areas misread in good faith. It was a story of deliberate structural complexity used to minimize tax exposure and regulatory oversight, which was different from fraud, legally and factually different. And the difference mattered enormously in terms of what prosecutors could charge and prove versus what they could assert. Huang's 2018 documents, when Shin finally obtained a legal summary of their content through a back channel, were significant. They were not decisive. They showed what they showed: original capitalization, funding sources, the initial formation of the holding structure, but they did not by themselves constitute the smoking gun Seojin had feared. They were evidence in a mosaic, damaging pieces, but pieces that required other pieces to become prosecutable. He gave them enough to open doors, Shin said, rubbing his eyes with 2 fingers. Not enough to walk through them without more. They'll get more, Taewoo said from the corner where he'd been sitting for 4 hours, still and watchful. They'll try, Shin said, which is why we move first. He looked at Seojin. I've drafted the voluntary disclosure framework. It addresses the MAPO structure, the 2021 transfer, and the 2018 capitalization. It characterizes everything as aggressive but legal tax structuring and offers full cooperation with the civil audit in exchange for resolution at the civil level. He pushed a document across the table. If you sign this, you're giving up the MAPO asset and a significant portion of the associated entities, everything in that chain. Seojin looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time without picking it up. The value, approximately 18% of your total legitimate holdings. 18%. He let the number sit for a moment. 18% of what he'd built, liquidated or surrendered to make the criminal exposure disappear. It was the price of having built the wrong way. It was also, if it worked, the price of keeping the other 82% intact and free from the kind of legal entanglement that would hollow out even what it didn't technically take. He picked up the pen. He signed. The filing went through Shin's office at 4:17 that afternoon. By 5, Hwang's attorney had called Shin's office. The tone of the call significantly changed from the positioning conversation of the previous day. Hwang had expected to arrive at the investigators with exclusive, damaging information. Instead, he arrived to find that Seojin had already provided his own account of the same transactions, in a framework that characterized Hwang's role in ways that were accurate and not favorable. The man who had calculated that cooperation would make him safe had discovered that the person he was cooperating against had gotten there first. Shin called Seojin at 6:15 with a 1-sentence update. Hwang's attorney is requesting a meeting to discuss aligned narratives. He wants to negotiate. He wants to stop being the one holding the most exposure. Tell his attorney we'll consider a meeting next week. Seojin paused. After our disclosure has been formally received and acknowledged. Understood. He put the phone down and sat in his office in the quiet of the early evening and felt something he didn't have a clean word for. Not victory, not relief. Something closer to the feeling after a serious physical injury starts to clot. The bleeding slows, the immediate crisis recedes, and what's left is the damage, which is real and permanent and going to require a long time to heal. He had signed away 18% of everything he'd built. He had given an honest account of structures he'd spent years protecting. He had called in favors he'd never intended to use. And he was still standing, barely, but standing. At 7 in the evening, his phone rang. The number on the screen was not one he recognized, but the area code was Nigerian, Lagos. He stared at it for 3 rings. He answered, Mr. Kang. The voice was a woman's, older, carrying an authority that was entirely natural, not performed. My name is Funmilayo Okoye. I believe you know my daughter. His chest went very still. Mrs. Okoye, he said. I'm not calling to be pleasant, she said, in the direct tone of a woman who did not consider pleasantness a prerequisite for necessary conversations. I'm calling because my daughter told me she met with you, and because I've spent 34 years raising that child, and I know when something has gotten under her skin. A pause. She told me what you said, at the cafe. He didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what response existed. She told me you said you wasted her, Funmilayo continued. Those were your words. Yes. That took something. A pause. Not softness, assessment. I want you to understand something, Mr. Kang. My daughter has survived things that would have broken a lesser person. She is not broken. She is also not finished grieving what she thought she was building with you, regardless of what her face shows you. Another pause. I'm not asking you to fix it. I don't think it can be fixed. I'm telling you that if you make what comes next harder for her than it has to be, in any way, through any channel, directly or indirectly, you will find that the people who love her are more creative than you might assume. I understand, he said. Good. A brief pause. She's talented, my daughter. She always was. She would have been fine with or without you. I want you to know that too. I know, he said. I knew it when I married her. I just forgot for a while. A silence. The kind where something unexpected has been said, and the other person is deciding what to do with it. You're not entirely stupid then, Funmileo said. Just mostly. She ended the call. Seojin sat with the phone in his hand for a long time. Outside, Seoul was moving through its evening, the city shifting from the velocity of the day to the different velocity of the night, the lights changing, the streets changing, the sound coming up through the glass of the window at a different frequency. He thought about Amara. He thought about the 4 in the morning he'd spent at his desk working through the shape of a legal strategy that would cost him 18% of his empire. He thought about signing the document. He thought about Huang's attorney's phone call and the particular satisfaction of knowing that the man who'd decided he was the least dangerous option in the room had been wrong. He thought about the cafe, her hands on the table, folded, her eyes direct and clear and neither warm nor cold, just honest, which was somehow the hardest thing to be in a room with. You lost a witness. Understood it better now, sitting in the aftermath of a day that had stripped away a significant portion of what he'd built, and clarified with brutal specificity which parts of the remaining structure were actually solid and which had been held together by the compliance of men who would comply only as long as it served them. She had seen that. She had seen it 3 years ago and had spent 3 years watching it become more true while he spent those years believing the opposite. I was still sitting in his office at 9 in the evening when Taewoo came back in. Taewoo set a folder on the desk. Not the urgent kind, not the bad news kind, the kind that simply needed to be dealt with, and stood waiting. There's one more thing, Taewoo said. Of course there is. Yuna Choi. Seojin looked up. He hadn't thought about Yuna in 4 days, which told him something about what Yuna had actually meant in the architecture of his choices. She spoke to a journalist, Taewoo said. Lifestyle press, not hard news. She gave an interview this afternoon. She hasn't published yet, the journalist is still working the story, but the content of the interview involves her relationship with you, and peripherally, Amara. Seojin's jaw tightened. What kind of peripherally? The kind where she characterizes herself as the reason the marriage ended and describes Amara in terms that are, Taewoo paused, which he almost never did, unflattering. The anger that came up was clean and fast and completely different from the complicated, grief-adjacent feeling of the past week. This was simple. A woman who had been given a clean exit, a definitive, unambiguous end to something that should never have started, had decided that her version of events deserved a public stage. And in placing herself on that stage, she was going to drag Amara's name into a story that Amara had nothing to do with except as a victim of it. Stop it, he said. How far? All the way. He said it without heat, which was the version of him that meant it completely. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. That story does not publish. Not that journalist, not any journalist. And when it's handled, I want Yuna to understand very clearly that the clean exit she was given is the only version available to her, and that the alternative to taking it quietly is significantly worse. Understood. Do it tonight. Taewoo left. Seojin stood and walked to the window. The city at 9 p.m. on a Thursday, cars and light and the distant sound of things happening at street level that reached the 53rd floor as a low collective murmur. He pressed his forehead against the glass briefly. The glass was cold. He pulled back. He looked at the reflection of his office behind him. The desk with the papers, the legal pad, the disclosure document, Amara's letter still visible at the corner of the desk where he'd left it when he picked up the pen to sign. The folder Taewoo had brought. The chair where Shin had sat for 6 hours and built the framework for surrendering 18% of his life's work. He looked like a man who had been in a fight, not the physical kind. There was no blood, no bruising, none of the marks that bodies leave on each other when things go wrong. But the other kind. The kind where every system of belief you've relied on gets stress-tested in rapid succession, and some of them hold and some of them don't, and you have to stand in the rubble of the ones that didn't and figure out what the structure looks like going forward. His phone buzzed. A message from Taewoo, journalist handled, Yuna informed. He put the phone face down on the desk. He opened his laptop. He went to the folder of financial statements his assistant had been sending daily for a week, and he hadn't been opening. He started reading. 82% of what he'd built. going through it now with the specific clarity of a man who no longer had the luxury of looking away from his own structures. He could see, with a precision he hadn't allowed himself before or hadn't needed to before, exactly which parts of what remained were genuinely clean and which were operating in the gray space that had made the Mappo situation possible in the first place. There was more gray than he'd consciously admitted. He started making notes. Not legal strategy notes. Different notes. The kind that were about making decisions, not avoiding consequences. He wrote for an hour and a half without stopping, and when he stopped he had 3 pages of things that needed to change, and a rough sequence for changing them. It would cost more than 18% when it was done. Probably significantly more. Not in legal exposure, the voluntary disclosure had addressed most of that, but in the choice to rebuild certain operations on different foundations, which meant dismantling the current foundations, which meant loss. He could absorb it. Not easily. Not without it being genuinely painful in ways he'd have to look at every quarter for the next several years. But he could absorb it and still have something that worked and something that was, for the first time, actually clean. He sat back and looked at the 3 pages. This was not what he'd planned. None of it. Not the audit, not Huang, not the 18%, not the 3 pages of restructuring notes sitting on his desk at 10:30 on a Thursday night, was anywhere near what he'd imagined his life looking like 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, his life had been the glass of water with the ring in it, the ring resting at the bottom, the small pale reflection it threw on the counter in the early morning light. 2 weeks ago, his whole world had been in that glass, and he hadn't known it yet. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from a number he recognized. Elena Park's office line, which meant it was not from Elena Park at this hour, but from whoever she'd asked to relay a message. The message read, "My client has received confirmation that the voluntary disclosure was filed today. She has instructed me to inform you that the insurance policy, as discussed, is no longer active. The secondary arrangement with Mr. Baik has been dissolved effective this evening." He read it twice. She had watched him make the move. She had seen the disclosure, understood what it cost him, understood what it meant, not just legally, but in terms of the kind of decision it represented about who he was choosing to be. And she had dissolved the filing, removed the mutual deterrence, stepped back from the position she'd built with 5 months of careful preparation. She wasn't doing it for him. He was clear about that. Whatever she was doing, it was not for him. It was for herself, her own sense of what was fair, her own standards about proportionality, her own judgment about what the situation now required from her. She had prepared a defense, and the defense had worked in the sense that she was free and safe and building what she wanted to build, and now the defense was no longer necessary, and she had put it down, because that was who she was. He sat with that for a long time. Then he picked up his pen and added one more item to the bottom of the 3 pages of notes. Not a business restructuring item, something different. He stared at it for a moment after he wrote it, then closed the legal pad without second-guessing himself. The way you close a door on something you know you're going to have to walk through eventually. But not tonight, not yet, when the rubble is still settling and the structure of what comes next is only just beginning to take its first recognizable shape. The note at the bottom of the 3rd page said, "Find a way to tell her the truth, not to get her back, just because she deserves to hear it from you directly." He'd written it at 10:47 on a Thursday night with a pen that was running low on ink, pressing harder toward the end of the sentence to make sure the words came through, and then he'd closed the legal pad over it and not looked at it again for 11 days. Those 11 days were not quiet. They were the hardest 11 days of sustained work Seojin had done in 20 years, which was saying something, because he had built an empire during years that were not easy, and he had maintained it through moments that required the kind of focus most people never have to produce. But those years had been hard in the way of a man fighting to gain something. These 11 days were hard in the way of a man fighting to give something up, which is a different muscle entirely, and one he had not previously been required to develop. The voluntary disclosure framework moved through Shin's office with the precision of something that had been prepared for speed. Every document that needed to be filed was filed within 48 hours of Seojin's signature. The city audit investigators received the package on a Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon Shin called to say that Inspector Go Byung-chan had confirmed receipt and noted the proactive nature of the cooperation in his case log, which was not nothing. Huang's attorney called Shin's office 3 times in the first 4 days after the disclosure. Each call was a variation on the same theme: alignment, shared narrative, mutual benefit. Each call was answered with the same patient, professional deflection that communicated, without ever saying so directly, that Seojin's account of events had already been filed and was already on record and was not going to be adjusted to accommodate a man who had spent the previous week calculating his own exit. On the fifth day, Huang's attorney stopped calling. On the sixth day, Director Huang retained a second attorney, a criminal defense specialist whose appearance in the matter told everyone who understood these things that Huang had received some information about his own exposure that had changed the temperature of his calculations considerably. Seojin heard about the second attorney from Tai Wu and said nothing. I was sitting at his desk at the time, going through the restructuring documents that were now arriving in daily batches from 3 different legal and financial teams working in parallel. He set the phone down after Tai Wu's update and went back to the documents. And he noticed, somewhere in his chest, a specific absence. The absence of satisfaction. He had expected to feel something when Huang's position deteriorated. Some version of the cold, clean feeling that came with watching an enemy's strategy collapse. He didn't feel it. He felt tired. And something that was almost pity, which surprised him enough that he sat with it for a moment before moving on. Huang was a man who had spent 40 years in rooms where loyalty was transactional, and he had made the transactional calculation, and the calculation had not worked the way he planned. That was not a victory Seojin could take pleasure in, because it was too close a mirror. A man who had built his world on other people's compliance, discovering that compliance always has a ceiling, always has a price above which it stops. He had been that man. He was still that man, in many ways. But he was trying, in the slow and unglamorous way of trying that doesn't look like anything from the outside, to be less of him. The 3 businesses he wound down closed quietly over the course of 2 weeks. The people inside them were notified with more care than was strictly required. Individual conversations, not mass emails, not the impersonal language of corporate restructuring. Taewoo handled most of the logistics, and Seojin handled the conversations that required him specifically, the ones with people who had been with him long enough that anything less than a direct conversation from him would have been its own kind of insult. One of those conversations was with a man named Ro Sung-min, who had run one of the closing operations for 7 years, and who sat across from Seojin in a restaurant they'd met in dozens of times and listened to the full explanation without interrupting and then said quietly, "I always knew this day would come. I just didn't think you'd be the one to call it." "What do you mean?" Seojin said. "I mean, I thought it would be a prosecutor or a rival or some external thing that forced the end." Ro looked at him. "I didn't think you'd do it yourself." "It was time," Seojin said. Ro looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. "Okay." He picked up his drink. "For what it's worth, I'm glad it was you." On the 11th, Seojin opened the legal pad. He read the note. He sat with it for long enough that the light in the office changed, the afternoon moving toward early evening without him tracking it. Then he picked up his phone and called Elena Park. She answered on the 4th ring, professional even at 7:30 in the evening, the tone of someone who had been expecting a call and had prepared for it. "Mr. Kang, I'd like to request a meeting with your client," he said. "Not a negotiation, not a legal conversation. I want to be clear about that distinction before you pass it along." A pause. Considered. "She dissolved the secondary arrangement 11 days ago. There's no outstanding matter that requires—" "I know. That's not why I'm asking." He stopped. He had prepared for this part too, and he threw the preparation out the same way he'd thrown out the speech. "I owe her a conversation. I handled the last one wrong. I'd like to try again, on her terms, at her location, with whatever conditions she requires." The pause this time was longer. "I'll pass it along," Elena Park said finally. "Thank you." He put the phone down and waited. The answer came back in 2 days. Not through Elena Park's office line. A message from an unknown number that he nonetheless recognized. He'd had Taewoo identify the number without telling Taewoo why. As Amara's personal cell. A number she had never given him. A number she had chosen, at some point between the cafe and now, to send from herself. The message said, Saturday, 2 p.m. I'll send the address. The address arrived Friday evening, Mapogu, 3rd floor. He went alone. He'd told Taewoo because he told Taewoo everything operational, but he told him in the tone that communicated this was not a situation requiring presence. and Taewoo had received the communication and said nothing and stayed where he was. The building was 5 floors, clean, unremarkable in the way of buildings that are exactly what they need to be without trying to be more. He took the elevator to the 3rd floor and stood in front of her door, and felt, for the first time in as long as he could remember, genuinely uncertain about what he was going to say. Not because he hadn't thought about it. He had thought about it for 11 days, in the margins of every legal document and financial statement and restructuring conversation. He had thought about it standing at his kitchen counter at 5 in the morning and lying in bed at midnight, staring at the ceiling of the penthouse that still smelled, faintly and inexplicably, like her in the specific corners where she'd spent the most time. He had thought about it until thinking about it stopped producing anything useful, at which point he had decided to simply go and be honest, which was the thing he should have been from the beginning. He knocked. She opened the door herself. Dark trousers, a plain cream top, her hair pulled back. Small gold earrings he recognized from the early years. Not the ones he'd bought her later, the bigger ones, the ones she wore correctly and never reached for. These were hers from before him. She looked at him with the clear, direct attention she'd always had and stepped back to let him in. The apartment stopped him for a moment, though he didn't show it. It was small and organized and entirely hers. The kind of space that told you exactly who lived in it, not because of any deliberate statement making, but because of the accumulated specificity of someone's actual preferences. Books on shelves organized by the country of origin of the author. A wooden bowl on the kitchen counter with fruit in it, the same kind of bowl she'd had in the penthouse. And something about seeing that particular object in this different context hit him in a way he hadn't prepared for. Art on the walls he didn't recognize, which meant she'd chosen it after she left. A desk near the window with a laptop and stacked papers, and a mug with dried coffee in it, which meant she'd been working this morning and gotten absorbed and let the coffee go cold, which was a thing she'd always done. It looked like a life that had been set down deliberately, without apology or transitional framing, not a life between things. A life. "Sit down," she said, and went to the kitchen. He sat on the sofa, slightly worn at the arm. He put both hands on his knees and looked at the bookshelf, and tried to read the logic of the organization, and had worked it out, country of origin, starting with Nigeria. By the time she came back with 2 cups of tea and set them on the table between them and settled into the chair across from him, she folded her hands around her cup and looked at him with the expression that was not invitation and not barrier, but simply attention. The same attention she'd always had. The thing he had mistaken, in the early days, for confidence and had gradually understood was something more foundational. The quality of a person who knows what they are and doesn't require the room's confirmation. "You can start," she said. He looked at her. At the steadiness. At the earrings. At the hands around the cup, and the way she sat in her own apartment on her own chair with the specific ease of someone who owns the space they're in, not because of money or power, but because they have filled it with themselves. "I didn't come with a speech," he said. "I had one. I threw it out." "Good," she said. "The last time we talked, at the cafe, I said I wasted you. I meant it, but I said it like a confession, something I needed to say for my own relief." He paused. He kept his eyes on her face. "That's not honesty. That's a transaction wearing honesty's clothes." She waited. "I was unfaithful for 2 years," he said, direct, undecorated. "Not a mistake I made and stopped. 2 years of consistent choice, repeated, while you were living in my home and building a life in my world and treating my staff with more genuine respect than I showed you. I told myself the 2 things existed separately, that what I had with Yuna didn't diminish what I had with you." He breathed. "That's not how it works. I know that now. Every time I made that choice, I was choosing it instead of you. The separation I constructed was a story I needed to survive what I was doing. It wasn't real." The apartment was quiet. The sound of the street below came up faintly. A car, voices, someone's music 2 windows over. "I also told myself you didn't know," he said, "for over a year after you knew. You were sitting across from me every day knowing everything, and I was sitting across from you congratulating myself on how cleanly I was managing my life, while you were managing your exit." He let that sit for a moment. "You were smarter than me, more honest with yourself, more disciplined in what you were actually building compared to what I was telling myself I was building." "I wasn't smarter," she said. "I was paying attention. Those aren't the same thing." "Maybe not. He didn't argue the distinction. But you were doing it, and I wasn't, and the result was the same. She looked at him steadily. Why did you marry me? The question arrived without warning, and he felt it the way you feel a step that isn't there when you're descending in the dark. The sudden shift, the reorientation. He sat with it for a moment because she deserved a real answer, not the first available one. Because you were real, he said. Every person in my world, by the time I met you, was performing something. They were afraid of me, or they wanted something from me, or they were managing how I saw them. You weren't doing any of that. You wanted the view and the shrimp, and you told me I was blocking them. He paused. I had been surrounded by performance for so long that actual realness felt like, I don't know, like clean water after years of drinking something with too much in it. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. I married you because I wanted to live inside something real. And then I kept choosing the easier thing instead. The thing that didn't require me to grow into the person you'd married. I chose the smaller version of myself, over and over, and I dressed it up as stability. Amara set her cup down. She stood and went to the window, the same way she'd always moved toward windows when she needed to think. Not dramatically, not as a statement, just the habitual movement of a person who thinks better looking outward. She stood with her back to him, looking down at the street. I loved you, she said to the window. Not to him. To the fact of it, which existed in the room between them regardless of whether anyone was looking at it. I need you to understand that with specificity, not the penthouse, not the danger of your world, which I knew about and which was never what interested me, not the version of you that the rest of Seoul was afraid of. A pause. The actual person, who moved out of my way at a window and then looked embarrassed for finding it charming, who called his mother every Sunday until he didn't and could never explain why he'd stopped, who read things, real things, not industry reports, and thought about them and had opinions about them that surprised me. She turned, looked at him. I love that man. I know, he said, and he said it simply, without any of the instinct toward deflection or qualification that had governed him for 20 years. And I watched that man make smaller choices, month after month, year after year. Her voice was steady, not cold, the steadiness of someone who has passed through the fire of this and come out with the burns healed into something durable. I wasn't asking you to be perfect. I was asking you to try. With me. At the actual thing we were supposed to be building together. She folded her arms across her chest, not defensively, just a holding of herself. You tried at your business. You tried at your reputation. You tried at the relationships that could give you power or leverage. You didn't try at us. No, he said. I didn't. She came back and sat down. Not in the chair this time, on the other end of the sofa. Closer, but not close. The specific geography of two people who were no longer in each other's orbit, but were choosing, for this hour, to be in the same room without armor. After I left, I was angry for 4 days, she said. She looked at the tea table between them. Pure, uncomplicated angry. The kind I'd been holding back for over a year because I needed to think clearly, and anger makes you sloppy. She looked up. Then the anger finished, and what was underneath it was grief, which I wasn't prepared for. I thought I had done the grieving while I was still inside it, while I was preparing to go. She shook her head slightly. You can't grieve in advance. The grief just waits for you to be somewhere safe enough to feel it. I'm sorry, he said. The word had different dimensions than it had at the cafe. Not the dimensions of apology as transaction, apology as release, just the actual thing. 2 words carrying the weight of what they actually meant without trying to do more than that. She heard the difference. He watched it land on her. A slight shift in the set of her shoulders, the specific quality of someone receiving something that is being offered without strings. I know you are, she said. They sat for a moment in that, the tea cooling on the table between them, the street sounds moving through the window, the afternoon light doing what afternoon light does, changing by such slow degrees that you never see the change itself, only the changed state you arrive at without having watched the transit. The restructuring, she said. Elena told me the scope of the voluntary disclosure, 18%. Yes. And the 3 businesses. Yes. He looked at her. How do you know about those? The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The shape of one. The specific, understated humor that had been one of the first things about her that made him keep looking. I pay attention, she said. I always paid attention. I know that now. The 3 businesses. The investigators didn't require those. That was beyond the disclosure framework. Yes. Why? He thought about the legal pad, the 3 pages of notes, the item at the bottom that had nothing to do with business restructuring. Because I read the document you left me about 40 times, he said. And every time I read it, I understood something different. Not about the legal exposure, about the kind of man those structures required me to be in order to maintain them. He looked at the table between them. I don't want to be that man. Do you know who you want to be instead? No, not fully. He almost smiled himself, a tired version of it, real and without performance. I have a general direction and 3 pages of notes and a lawyer whose billing is going to require its own restructuring. He looked up. That's where I am. She looked at him. The attention had not changed. It had never changed. Not across 3 years of dinner tables, not in a cafe near the Noxon Park steps. Not now. The same clear, patient, direct scene that had made him move out of someone's way at a window 20 years ago in the wrong direction, and then 21 months later in the right one. You know I'm not coming back, she said. I know. I need you to actually know that. Not the version where you say it and somewhere beneath it there's a Amara. He said her name quietly, and she stopped. I know. That's not why I'm here. She waited. I'm here because you are the only person in my life who was honest enough and close enough to show me something true about myself. And you did it without trying to punish me. You built an exit, and you protected yourself, and when the exit worked, you dissolved a filing you'd spent 5 months constructing because you decided it was no longer proportionate. He paused. He breathed. You have been more decent to me than I had any rational claim to. I wanted to sit in a room with you and say that out loud with nothing to negotiate and nothing to gain from saying it. The room held the silence for a moment. Okay, she said, soft. Not a concession, a receipt. The specific softness of someone allowing something to be received rather than managed. They sat for a while after that without either of them reaching for words. The tea went cold. The light shifted. Somewhere below, a child was laughing, sudden and brief and entirely unaware of being heard. Your mother called me, he said. Amara looked up. I know, she told me, last week. She called me first, he said, a week ago, to make certain I understood the consequences of making things harder for you than necessary. Amara held his gaze for a moment. Then she put one hand over her face and made a sound that lived in the complicated territory between a laugh and something more than a laugh. The sound of a person being genuinely, helplessly surprised by someone they love. She didn't tell me she called you first, she said, hand still over her eyes. I think she didn't want you to tell her not to. Amara lowered her hand. She looked at him with an expression that was unguarded in a way the rest of the conversation had not been. Not careful, not composed, just real. She told you she called you to warn you, she said, but that wasn't really why she called. I know, he said. She called to find out who I was. Amara looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said quietly. She did. He paused. I think I passed, conditionally. The real smile came then, full and actual and not performed. It changed her whole face the way it always had, not by making it brighter exactly, but by making it more completely itself, the way a room looks more like itself when the right light is in it. He had lived beside that smile for 3 years and thought he was paying attention and had not paid nearly enough. It faded naturally, the way it always did, without drama, the way real things move, present, then done. She stood, and he understood the movement for what it was. Not abrupt, not a signal that the conversation had failed, the standing up of someone who has given what she came to give and received what she was willing to receive and is ready for the natural end of something. He stood too. She walked him to the door and he stopped at the threshold and turned. The consulting work, he said. Singapore fund. I heard through the legal channels. Nothing I was looking for. I know you weren't looking for it, she said. Elena mentioned the same channels. You're going to be very good at it. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite patience and not quite amusement, but lived in the neighborhood of both. I've always been very good at it, she said. I was very good at it 3 years before I met you. I was very good at it during 3 years of being your wife. I was doing it in my head while I was standing next to you at events where no one thought to ask my opinion about anything. She said it without heat, just fact. You don't need to tell me I'm going to be good at it. No, he said. I don't. He looked at her. I wanted to say it anyway. Because you deserve to hear it. Not from someone who wants something from it. Just said. She looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, she said. And it was the first time in the conversation she'd thanked him for anything, and the specificity of it, the precision of what she was accepting, was its own kind of generosity. He almost left then. His hand was on the door frame, his weight already shifting toward the hallway. Seojin, her voice. Behind him. He turned. She was standing with one hand on the door frame, mirroring his posture without having planned to. The light from the window behind her was the late afternoon kind, warm and specific, and making everything it touched look more considered than it probably was. She looked at him with the expression that was not quite the attention of the conversation and not quite the smile of the moment before. Something between the two, something that lived in the space where those two things overlapped. Don't disappear into being a better businessman and call it becoming a better person, she said. The legal restructuring, the voluntary disclosure, the 3 businesses, that's maintenance. That's repairing the structure. Structures aren't people. She held his gaze without apology for the directness of it. Figure out what you actually want from your life. When the thing you're building and the power you're accumulating aren't the answers you reach for automatically. Figure out who you are when nobody in the room is afraid of you. A pause. That's the harder thing. And it's the only thing that matters. From here. He stood in her doorway and let that land in all the places it needed to land without moving to manage it or qualify it or absorb it into a framework. Okay, he said. She nodded once. He left. He took the stairs. All 3 floors slowly, with his hand on the railing and the specific quality of the afternoon coming in through the stairwell windows and slanted strips. The kind of late-day light that makes everything look like it's being seen for the first time. He came out onto the street and stood on the pavement for a moment in the open air. Cool. The smell of the city and the particular combination that belonged to Mapo-gu, food and concrete, and the faint green of something growing in the small park 2 blocks over. He walked. He had not planned to walk. He had a car. Taewoo was parked 2 streets over, waiting with the specific patience of a man who had spent 11 years waiting for Seojin to finish one thing and move to the next. He did not call Taewoo. He put his hands in his pockets and walked in a direction that wasn't purposeful, just outward, and let the city come at him without managing it. He walked for a long time, through the neighborhood he didn't usually move through, past restaurants and small shops, and people going about their Saturday with the particular Saturday quality of people who have nowhere they have to be and are enjoying the fact. He walked past a school with a closed gate and an old man sitting outside a pharmacy reading something on his phone, and a group of teenagers on a corner doing the thing teenagers always did on corners, which was nothing in particular conducted with maximum social intensity. Ordinary Saturday evening, Seoul in its usual indifferent, ongoing aliveness. He ended up at the Han River. He hadn't been heading there deliberately. He'd been heading outward, generally, and outward in this part of the city meant, eventually, the river. He stood at the railing and looked at the water in the late afternoon light. It moved the way rivers always moved, which was with complete disregard for anyone watching it. Other people were there. Couples moving slowly along the path. A man with a dog who had decided the railing was the right place to be and was sitting with his back against it, looking at the sky. A woman running past with the focused, inward expression of someone in the middle of something they'd committed to. A group of university students spread across the bank with food and speakers playing music that reached Seojin at the railing as something distant and rhythmic and belonging to a different demographic occasion. He stood there. He thought about his mother and the call he owed her. Not the managed version, not the call where he provided a curated account of his week designed to minimize her worry. The other call. The one he'd been withholding for years because the honest version required admitting things that the son he wanted to be for her would not have done. He thought about Taiwu, parked 2 streets from Amara's apartment, waiting without impatience or judgment. Taiwu who had stayed when the operation contracted and the risk profile changed, and the implicit compensation of working in a world that moved with weight and consequence became more modest. Who had said simply, "I prefer it this way," and meant it. He thought about Shin, who had sat across a conference table from him for 6 hours and built something legal and defensible from materials that were neither, and who had looked at Seojin in the moment of signing and seen something, had seen a man making a real decision rather than a strategic calculation, and had nodded once and said nothing, which was more acknowledgement than most ceremonies managed. He thought about Ro Sung-min saying, "I thought it would be something external that forced the end. I didn't think you'd be the one to call it." He took out his phone and opened a new message to his mother. He typed, "I'm coming for dinner Sunday. I'll explain some things I should have explained a long time ago." He sent it before he could revise it into something safer, something that wouldn't require him to actually do what it promised. The response came in 40 seconds. His mother and her phone. She was faster on it than anyone he knew half her age. 3 words. "I'll make galbatang." He stood at the railing a little longer. His fingers in his coat pocket found the ring. He'd been carrying it since the morning he found it in the glass of water. Not consciously carrying it, he hadn't taken it out and held it and thought about it deliberately. He'd simply transferred it from pocket to pocket through every coat and suit he'd worn in the weeks since, the way you carry small things without accounting for them, and it had stayed, warm from his body heat, smooth and small and particular. He didn't take it out now either. He just held it inside his pocket, the metal between his fingers, and let himself know what it was. Not a relic, not a monument to something destroyed. A record, that was the word for it that felt accurate without being sentimental. A record of something that had been real. A marriage that had contained, at its center, an actual love. Not a performed love. Not a contractual love. Not the kind that exists primarily as a function of what each person gains from the arrangement. A real love between 2 specific people, one of whom had not been adequate to it, and one of whom had been more than adequate, had in fact been remarkable in her adequacy, and had eventually, with full clarity and without malice, put it down. He had been loved by someone who did not need him. That was the precise truth. She had chosen him from wanting, not from need, from the clear-eyed, genuine wanting of someone who knows what they are and is choosing something additional to that, something that adds to a life already functional and already full. And he had spent 3 years not understanding the specific rarity of that, not understanding that being chosen by someone who has no structural dependency on you choosing them back is a different thing entirely from being chosen by someone who needs you to hold something in their life together. He had held nothing together for her. She had been fine. She was fine. She was going to be fine in ways that were going to become increasingly and visibly remarkable. The ring in his pocket was the record of the fact that he had been given something extraordinary and had not known what it was while he had it. He was going to keep it. He had already made that decision without making it formally, had carried it for weeks without deciding to set it down, which was its own kind of decision. I was going to keep it because forgetting was not the same as growing, and the specific memory held in that small band of gold was the kind that should stay present rather than recede, the kind that should be allowed to keep doing its quiet and uncomfortable work. He turned from the river and walked back into the city. Taewoo was still parked where he'd said he'd be. He didn't ask where Seojin had been, or why he'd walked, or how long he'd been standing at the river. He pulled into traffic when Seojin got in and drove without needing direction, because after 11 years he knew the defaults. After a few minutes, Seojin said, "The operations review meeting Monday. I want to add something to the agenda." "What?" "I want to talk about compensation structure for the core team, the people who stayed through the restructuring. I want to look at what they were implicitly compensated for in the old structure, the risk premium, essentially, and figure out how to make the new structure worth staying in without that premium." Taewoo was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant change in how the organization has worked." "I know. Some of them will leave. Some of them were going to leave anyway." He looked out the window at the city going past in the early evening. "The ones who stay for the right reasons are the ones I want." Taewoo said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'll add it to the agenda." They drove through the evening city. Seojin watched it through the window. The lights coming on, the shift from the daytime city to the nighttime one. The particular quality of Seoul at this hour, when it was both winding down and revving up simultaneously, two different versions of the city occupying the same streets in the same moment. He thought about the note at the bottom of the third page. He had done what it said. He had said the true thing, in a room, out loud, with nothing to gain from saying it. He thought it was probably the most useful thing he'd done in months, possibly years. The months that followed were not cinematic. They were the months of doing the hard, undramatic thing repeatedly, of showing up to the restructured operations and making the slower, more considered decisions that the new structure required, of sitting across from Shin in a conference room on Thursdays and working through the remaining legal threads with the methodical patience of people who understood the work was going to take as long as it took, of having dinner with his mother on Sundays and telling her the truth when she asked about his week, which she always did, and which always required something from him that the managed version had not. His mother never said she was proud of him. That was not her register. What she did was feed him consistently and ask about specific things she'd mentioned the previous week, which meant she'd retained them and considered them, which was her version of the same thing. The MAPO audit resolved in the 4th month. Civil settlement, financial penalty noted on record, formal acknowledgement of cooperation. Inspector Go Byung-chan's case summary was 3 pages long, professional, and noted the voluntary disclosure framework as a significant factor in the resolution. The case closed without any of the outcomes that had felt possible in the first terrible week. No criminal referral, no escalation, no cascade into the secondary operations. Hwang took his lesser deal and retired. The announcement was 2 paragraphs in a business publication. Seojin read it on a Tuesday morning with his coffee and felt nothing in particular and moved on to the next item in his inbox, which was a staffing proposal from the logistics operation that needed review. Yuna Choi moved to Busan. Taewoo confirmed it without being asked, in the same update where he mentioned 3 other operational things, and Seojin noted it and said nothing. She was not his to feel guilty about in any ongoing way. She had made choices, and he had made choices, and the intersection of those choices had produced consequences that were finished. The ring stayed in his pocket. He moved it into a small dish on his nightstand eventually. Not gone, not displayed, just placed somewhere specific rather than carried. He looked at it sometimes when he was getting ready in the morning. It had the quality of a thing that had been looked at enough to stop being raw and become simply present. A fact. An object holding a fact. Across the world, in the 9th month after the morning of the water glass, Amara Okoye's name appeared in a Singapore financial journal in an analysis of emerging market risk structures that quoted her 3 times. The piece was 2,000 words long, and she was in it more than any other single voice, which was not something the journalist had planned, but something that had happened because what she said was consistently the most precise thing available. She read the piece on a Sunday morning before calling Chisum. She read it with her feet up on the chair across from her at the kitchen table in the Mapogu apartment she had stayed in because she liked the building and the neighborhood and the way the afternoon light came through the window. She read it and felt the particular uncomplicated satisfaction of work being recognized. And then she put the phone to her ear, and Chisum picked up on the second ring with the sound of one of the children in the background, and they talked for an hour about things that had nothing to do with work at all. She stayed in Seoul for another year before the Singapore Fund offered her a position that required presence in Singapore rather than consultation from a distance. And she took it, because it was the right next thing, and she had always moved toward the right next thing when it appeared. Before she left, she walked through the Mapogu apartment for the last time and packed what was hers and looked at what she was leaving behind. The furniture that had come with the place, the art she decided to leave for whoever came next, the small dish on the dresser that had held the penthouse key. The key was gone. She had returned it 6 months earlier, not to Seojin directly, but through building management, through the appropriate channel, which had felt like the appropriate channel for it. She looked at the empty dish for a moment. Then she put it in the box to take with her, because it was hers, and it was a good dish, and she moved on. The last evening in Seoul, she walked. She walked without particular destination, the same way she had walked in the early months after leaving. Not away from anything, not toward anything, just through. Through the city that had been hers for 5 years, the city where she had arrived as a strategist and become a wife, and unmade the marriage and remade herself and become something that she hadn't had precise language for yet, but that was growing more articulate as it grew more real. She walked along the Han River for a while, the lights on the water, the city on both banks, lit and ongoing. She stood at a railing and looked at the water moving and thought of nothing in particular, which was its own kind of rest. She thought briefly of Seojin. She allowed herself to wonder, in the specific and limited way she'd learned to wonder about him, how Sunday dinners with his mother were going, whether the restructuring had produced the clarity it had promised, or the kind that turns out to be a different entanglement wearing cleaner clothes. Whether the man she had loved, the real one, the one who moved out of someone's way and was surprised by finding it charming, was becoming more present or less as the months went on. She didn't know the answers. She wasn't going to know them. That was part of the architecture of having left correctly. Not burning things, not destroying what remained, but also not maintaining the kind of proximity that would let her track the answers to questions that were no longer hers to ask. She hoped he was figuring it out. She hoped it in the way you hope for someone you have genuinely loved and genuinely released. Not with longing, not with regret, with the specific, clean-edged goodwill of someone who has moved fully into their own life and can wish good things for a person who is no longer in it. She turned from the river. She walked back through the city in the direction of the apartment she was finishing the work of leaving, past the restaurant she had eaten at too many times to count, past the bookstore that had her credit card information saved from approximately 40 transactions, past the corner where the old man always sat outside the pharmacy in the evenings reading his phone. He was there tonight. She nodded at him as she passed. He looked up, slightly surprised by the acknowledgement, and nodded back, and she walked on. In the morning, she would fly to Singapore with her work and her wooden bowl and her books organized by the country of origin of their authors, starting with Nigeria, and she would set them down in a new place and let that place begin to know her in the way that places come to know people who fill them with themselves rather than with the right objects. She would be good at the next thing. She had always been good at the next thing. The city moved around her as she walked through it, not caring who she was or what she carried or where she was going, doing what cities do, which is simply continue. She walked through it, continuing with her hands at her sides and her step unhurried and the clear September air moving against her face, and she felt, in the particular and unglamorous and completely real way that free feels when it's actually true, and not just something you're telling yourself, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not arrived, not finished, not resolved into some final and completed version of herself. Just moving forward clearly at her own pace, in her own direction, carrying what was hers and having set down what wasn't, walking through the last evening of one version of her life toward the first morning of the next one. That was enough. It was more than enough.